Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining the Coalition for Asian American Children and Families today for our Mayoral Control information session, our one-on-one session, so that we can learn about a really important topic right now, given election season, but also just in our education equity climate, a conversation that so many advocates, many of you who are on today's call, talk about often when it comes to who should really be pulling the levers when it comes to education equity and our education system. Next slide. Thank you. I am Felicia Singh, Director of Policy and Government Relations here at CACF, and CACF was founded in 1986. We are the nation's only Pan-Asian children and families advocacy organization, and we do our policy change work by bringing together community-based organizations. So many of you are here today, thank you, as well as our youth and community members to fight for equity for Asian American Pacific Islanders. And our mission is to advocate specifically for marginalized AAPI children and families. And our vision is, and our hope is that for all children and families, including AAPIs in New York, to be safe, healthy, and able to reach their full potential in life. Next slide, please. The way we do our work is seen in almost like three big buckets. We have a leadership development program where we center youth voice and policy change work. Then we have our membership and coalition building, paid membership, and it's an opportunity to learn about the grants and subcontracts process through our wonderful grants and contracts team who support organizations through uptaking funding coming out of our equity budget, AAPI CSI, as well as other critical funding that we receive. And then we also do our work through policy advocacy, and that is our equity areas that we really focus in: budget equity, language, data disaggregation, education equity, health equity, and child welfare. So we're really excited to focus this in education equity. Education is integral and intersectional to all of the pieces in the work that we do, particularly through our leadership development program. So we're excited to really bring our community in to a critical conversation, and that is through a Mayoral Forum. Next slide. I'm going to pass
Hi,
that
everyone.
to
Hi, everyone. My name is Kulsum. I'm the Education Policy Coordinator here at CACF, and I think before we wanted to start the conversation on mayoral control, we wanted to share the CACF Ed Equity Agenda, which I'm sure some of you have seen before, and perhaps it's new to some others. Regardless, it's a great place to ground what we're talking about because mayoral control is a system in which we currently have to move through and advocate through. And these are the things we're advocating for. So mayoral control influences and impacts our policy asks for every single one of these topics, which I won't read all of them, but includes inclusive curriculum, right? Ensuring that we have resources for English language learners, students with disabilities, for students experiencing mental health challenges, and many, many other things that we at CACF and many of you across your organizations and individually are advocating for. So before we jump into talking about mayoral control and what it is and defining it, we wanted to take some space and kind of map out the key players in school governance, which mayoral control is a school governance model, right? And so mapping out and defining the key players, including the roles and responsibilities that key folks have, hopefully will help us kind of understand who's moving how. So we can envision what's working, maybe what's not working, and have a conversation from that point forward. So I'm gonna jump right into it. A few I know there's a lot of words on the screen. We'll definitely share out the slides later. Don't feel the need to have to read every word. I'll just go very brief overview on like who the key players are and what they're doing as it pertains to schools in New York City. So the mayor has ultimate authority over New York City public schools in a mayoral control model. The mayor is responsible for appointing the school chancellor, driving education policy, funding allocations for schools, is a key stakeholder and thus has a lot of influence at the state legislature and various in setting citywide ed priorities. And we mentioned the chancellor. So the mayor is appointing the chancellor, and the chancellor oversees the New York City Department of Education. So the chancellor is overseeing curriculum advancements, instruction, hiring, school-related hiring that the DOE is engaging in. It influences the ways that budget is being managed. Resources are being allocated in schools across New York City. These are the things that the chancellor is overseeing via the Department of Education, and thus Department of Education being the agency that runs New York City public schools. So we're going to do a fun thing, which is we're going to have some polls throughout today. And I'm going to just share our first poll question in just a second, which is, how is the school chancellor chosen? Which I just did share, but it's okay if perhaps we need a reminder. But let me just make it live. I'm going to give folks 20 more seconds. Amazing. Y'all are amazing. Folks for listening. I feel affirmed in that. It looks like most folks got this correct, which is that the mayor appoints the chancellor. Okay. That is great. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Right. Moving right on ahead. Sorry if that felt like a pop quiz. This is my warning in advance that there will be poll questions moving forward, but they are as easy as that one was. All right, so the next thing, stakeholder, that's really important to understand as it pertains to school governance is the New York State Legislature and governor. And so New York State Legislature, governor, they collaboratively or work together to make laws that impact New York City public schools, right? In terms of mayoral control, it's pretty important because they determine whether to renew, modify, or discontinue mayoral control as a system in New York City. They, of course, also have a massive influence / drive education funding at the state level, which, of course, impacts this funding that New York City schools are receiving. And related in terms of bodies of government is the New York City Council. And so the New York City Council approves the city budget, works with the mayor in this moment, or has to advocate to the mayor at times, many times, in terms of the school budget. But there is this dynamic at play. Holds hearings on education issues, has the ability to advocate for school improvements, capital fund improvements, these sorts of things. The next kind of body entity of government is the New York State Education Department Board of Regents. You may have heard the word regents before as it pertains to a test, but this is a Board of Regents, which is a body of leaders that oversee the New York State Education Department. So the Board of Regents is appointed by the state legislature and sets statewide education standards and graduation requirements, appoints the New York State Ed Commissioner, which is currently Betty Rosa. They are responsible for enforcing education laws and regulations, overseeing standardized testing, curriculum frameworks, and monitoring compliance of existing laws in school districts, among other things. But this is again, I'm doing very high level general, and there's, of course, a lot of weeds everywhere that we can dive into at various other points. The next point, I promise we're almost done with the defining aspect, is community schools and districts. So New York City is divided into 32 school districts, and the school districts are overseen by superintendents, and each superintendent is appointed by the chancellor, who we shared earlier oversees the New York City Department of Education. The the districts implement kind of more local policies. They work with principals, teachers, parents, right, even students at times, to address local concerns and things like that. They're evaluating schools, overseeing academic performance, things like that. And then the next kind of stakeholder to understand is community education councils, or CECs. These are local advisory bodies that are supposed to represent parent voices. Because there are 32 school districts, it makes sense that there's 32 CECs, one for each district. There are elected parents and a couple appointed members in each school district. And it's important to note that while this is an entity that represents parent voices, CECs don't have too much power in actually implementing policy or impacting outside of in an advisory role. Okay, so next poll question. I'm getting the hang of a poll, so I appreciate everyone's patience. Let me to the next one. All right. Hopefully this is an easy one too. How many school districts are there in New York City? Folks, 10 more seconds. Okay. I'm going to share results. I should have done that last time. But looks like most folks got it. 32 school districts. That's good. Folks are paying attention. Love that. Stop sharing. Great. Onward. Okay, I promise this is the last stakeholder, last definition that we're hearing today, as it pertains to important stakeholders. This is the panel for educational policy, aka the Board of Education for New York City. They vote on various policy decisions, including contracts, school closures. They review the Department of Education's budget. They have a kind of robust process in terms of like who is appointed and perhaps who's so there's a discussion, right, that we'll get into as to who's a part of this and who isn't necessarily a part of this. But some key things to understand: there are members of PEP that are mayoral appointees. There are members that are borough president's appointees. There are members that are CEC president appointees, right? And then there are other kind of advisory, like ex officio members. These are non-voting members, which include the chancellor, to high school students. Again, they don't have voting ability, but they're advisory. And there is various dynamics at play in terms of kind of who makes up the PEP and who can be in them and things like that, which we'll get into soon. But just to know that this is another name for the Board of Education. So if you hear this term, important to note because sometimes it's said interchangeably. Okay, so the next question, I'm going to share the poll. Okay, the questions are getting harder. This is a not question, but who does not have a role in selecting who is on PEP? Folks, 20 more seconds. All right. like I tricked many of you on this one. I believe I'm sharing the results. So the correct answer is the chancellor. The chancellor does not have a role in selecting a member PEP. Also, yes, thank you, Sheena, for clarifying on the superintendent and school district's point. I appreciate that. Going to move on ahead. Okay, I'm so sorry. I did definitely lie to you all. There's another slide on definitions, but it's an important one. It's important to know the unions. It's important to know the folks who are advocating for teachers, who make up the teachers, staff, and school employees. Won't go into it too much here, but just understanding the role that unions have in influencing and advocating on behalf of a lot of the employees and key staff members that make up the school system, right? So this is teachers, staff, administrators, all of the above. Okay, so we'll pause there with the definitions, and I'm going to now pass the mic to Shino, who will perhaps clarify on anything else that I said that was not fully accurate, and also then define what mayoral control is and how we got here to this system today. So passing the mic over. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Shino. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I have been an advocate for public schools in New York City since around 2003, right around the time when mayoral control came into existence. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to be sharing a little bit about what is mayoral control. And despite what 𝘾𝙤𝙮 just said, I'm probably going to make it even more confusing rather than clarifying what's been presented so far. So bear with me. We do have a super complicated system. So what is mayoral control? Mayoral control means that the New York City mayor has direct control over the public school system, appointing the school's chancellor and overseeing policy decisions. So one of the good examples of good, bad, well, one of the examples, let's just not put value Jasmine on here. Some of the examples that I can share with you. Michael Bloomberg, when he was the mayor and took control of the school system, he unilaterally decided to change the promotion criteria, grade promotion criteria for elementary school students. And he proposed that students are going to be, students' promotion from grade to grade will be decided solely based on standardized test scores in ELA and math. That was his policy decision. And he actually removed members of the panel for educational policy who were going to vote against that system. But that was one of the earliest examples of the tyranny of mayoral control. The mayor comes up with a policy that was actually against ample research that says retaining students is not going to help those students. But that was his policy, that we're going to retain students or hold them back a grade if they don't pass the ELA math test. There is actually some good examples of having one person be in charge, and that is the pre-K rollout that former Mayor de Blasio was really big on. He really pushed through that universal pre-K as much as he could because he didn't have all the layers of decision making that he had to worry about. He could just come up with a policy decision to roll out pre-K for every student and then get the PEP to vote to approve that. So there have been some instances where having one person make all the decisions push some good things forward. But the flip side of that coin is there have been some really bad policies, harmful policies that have been pushed forward because there was only one person responsible. So the mayoral control system replaced the former community school boards. So the 32 community school districts, which still exist today, used to have their own little school boards for each of their communities, and they had a lot of decision-making powers. And it was really a decentralized way of making decisions. So that was the decentralized authority through the community school boards, even though the powers of local community school boards had been taken away piece by piece prior to the mayoral control. So by the time mayoral control came around, community school boards did not have a lot of powers left either. So pre-2002 system, we had the New York City Board of Education. That is still actually the title given to the body in the state law. It's the Board of Education of the City of New York with 7 members. Each of the 5 borough presidents appointed 1 member, and the mayor appointed 2 members. So it was still an appointed board, but the borough president and the mayor both appointed members. The Board of Education oversaw citywide education policy, as well as budget, curriculum, and leadership hiring, such as superintendents. They also appointed the school's chancellor, right? As a board, they appointed the school chancellor. And decision-making was actually slow and fragmented. As you can imagine, 5 borough presidents appointed people and mayor appointed 2, and they don't necessarily agree. And the budget decision still rested with the mayor. The mayor was the one who had to present the preliminary budget, including the budget for the DOE. And then the Board of Education would be butting heads with the mayor on the budget issues. So there was a lot of slow decision-making and political infighting of sorts going on in the pre-mayoral control system. Next slide, please. So then pre-mayoral control, we did have 32 community school boards, each made up of 9 elected members. So they were full-blown elections going on for the 32 community school boards. They hired and supervised local superintendents, and they also managed zoning, school zoning for elementary schools and middle schools, school level budgets, and some curriculum decisions as well. They had input on hiring principals and staffing at local schools. So they really oversaw what was going on in individual schools within their community school districts. And the chancellor was accountable to politically diverse Board of Education, right? You can imagine if you're the chancellor appointed by the Board of Education, but on this Board of Education, you have 5 borough president appointees and 2 mayoral appointees. That was a pretty challenging job, trying to manage the political expectations of those appointing authorities. And the chancellor often lacked the power or stability to implement large-scale reforms. It wasn't up to the chancellor to start new initiatives or really create some significant changes to the system. Next slide, please. So then Michael Bloomberg lobbied the state legislature to create mayoral control. And in 2002, the legislature authorized mayoral control, and that's what we've had since 2002 legislative session. It has been reauthorized multiple times in the past 23 years now, but ultimately the mayor still holds the authority over all decisions, including appointing the chancellor. That still remains the mayor's authority, setting priorities for the Board of Education, which again, it is still the Board of Education in the state law. It was Michael Bloomberg who decided to just give it a different name and call it the Panel for Educational Policy. But legally, it is still the Board of Education. And the mayor still has a very heavy role in determining school budget, because under the city charter, the city's budget is still the responsibility of the mayor. Next slide, please. Since mayoral control went into effect, again, it was Mayor Bloomberg who named the Board of Education the panel of educational policy. It has evolved quite a bit. PEP now has 23 members appointed by various authorities, including the mayor, the borough presidents, and community education council presidents. That was something new. PEP used to be a much smaller body. It was the mayor and the borough presidents appointing. And then along the way, advocates got together and said, we need to create more checks and balances. So we started adding all these other members onto the PEP. PEP members still vote on the contracts and school opening and closings and reviews DOE budget. So they still have the power to review and approve these important decisions that the DOE makes. Community school boards were replaced by community education councils. So we no longer have community school boards at the local level, and they're replaced by community education councils or CECs. And they are largely advisory and really do not hold any formal power except for school zoning decisions. School rezoning is a really contentious issue. So that one really difficult contentious issue, they left it up to the Community Education Council to make decisions. They didn't want to own that messy stuff. So they left that for the parents who are serving on the Community Education Councils. Next slide, please. Okay, another poll.
All right, for the poll, it's which mayor established mayoral control? It was definitely named a couple of times as Shino was presenting. We have our latest 4 biggest hits on the screen here as our mayors. All right, I'm gonna give folks maybe 10 more seconds. All right. Looks like most folks were right on the money. It was Mayor Bloomberg who established mayoral control. Nice job, everyone.
Excellent. So the last slide, recapping. Yes. So the mayor has the most control under the current system. We've been adding members to the PEP. So it's now a 23-member board, but it's still ultimately the mayor who selects the majority of the members on the PEP. And even though mayors cannot remove members, their own appointees without cause, we managed to actually amend the law to put that in there because Bloomberg just removed members who were going to vote against him. And we didn't think that was democratic. So we were able to ask the state legislature to amend the law so that the mayor cannot remove their appointees without a good reason. And if the mayor removes a member, then the mayor actually has to issue a written statement on why the member was removed. So that's good, except there are other ways to remove members who don't follow the mayor's order. And that's happened a few times in the past under Mayor de Blasio, surprisingly. A member who votes against the mayor's will can be completely ghosted by the department staff. This is a true story. There was a member who voted against the mayor's proposal on some issue. She was no longer invited to briefings held for PEP members. She was no longer given adequate communication except for meeting dates and notices for a meeting location, but no background information was given to that member anymore. The department completely ghosted this member so that member couldn't be participating in the process meaningfully because she was not given all the background materials. So that member finally resigned. There have been another member who was strongly urged to resign. So there are still ways for the mayor to remove members who defy his will. The chancellor manages day-to-day education decisions, but again, the chancellor defers to the mayor for some really sticky issues. There have been very few chancellors who would actually stand up against the mayor to do what the chancellor himself or herself thought was the right thing to do, because the mayor can fire the chancellor at will. The PEP has oversight, but still, it is largely controlled by mayoral appointees. They have the majority. Community voices, Community Education Council voices, teachers, other parents, and students provide input, but have very limited formal power. You can go to CEC meetings and complain about the curriculum choices or some policy that the DOE is rolling out, but it's like screaming into the winds most times because there is no legal process to appeal decisions made by the PEP. And there are really still few checks and balances to the power that the mayor has over making decisions. But the state lawmakers decide if mayoral control continues, changes, or ends. Ultimately, it is the state legislature that makes this decision. They can continue it as is. They can continue it with changes, which is what they have been doing. They have been continuing it with amendments, or they have the choice of ending it. Now, there's very little appetite to ending it because if you end mayoral control today, the law reverts back to the pre-mayoral control school board system. There were a lot of problems with the school board system, and there's very little appetite, even amongst the activists and parents and educators, to want to go back to the old school board system. So what this tells us is we need a new system. And it's worth mentioning that there are a couple things that came out of the mayoral control that are worth preserving. One, the community education councils, although they don't have a lot of real power, they are made up of parents of public school students. That is something that I want to see preserved in the new system, whatever the new system might be. The old school board did not require members to be parents of the public school system. And, that's how school boards run everywhere else. But I do think having parents of kids in public school system be at the table for decision-making process is a good system. We also allow immigrant parents without US citizenship to participate in the voting process for Community Education Council. I think that's actually a really important piece of this system that we ought to preserve, particularly for the AAPI communities, because we have a lot of parents who are not able to participate in other elections because they don't have citizenship. But for the community education councils, if they have kids in the public school system, they can vote. And that is something that I would love to see continue. But what we really need is a democratic process that doesn't allow one person, the mayor, to make all these decisions that affect 1 million children in the system. So that is the end of my rant. Thank you so much for your patience. And I'll hand it off back to Kulsum.
Thank you so much for kind of sharing with us in an abridged version how we got here, what we're seeing, some benefits perhaps of some learnings of things that work, some things that don't work in both. And this is a perfect cue to the next section, which we want to talk about why this matters. So we've kind of given you who are the key stakeholders, who are the key players, what is the system right now, what was the system. but we haven't really talked about why it matters. In particular, why does it matter to the AAPI community? I think Shino, throughout the portion she was speaking, sprinkled in key examples as to indicate why this matters, right? Getting universal pre-K, that's why it matters. Ensuring that our students have access to language resources, that's why something like this matters. But we're going to go into a couple of key other key examples as to why we should care about our governance model as it pertains to schools. And we'll focus predominantly on funding, but we'll also talk about some other policy areas. So reflecting on this year's New York City budgeting process, I want to review a few stats and numbers with folks to frame the importance of this matter. So about a lot more than 18% of New York City public schools students are of Asian descent. This is significant because that means there's a significant population from our community that are a part of New York City public schools that are currently being underfunded, defunded, and these schools are often unable to meet the needs of our students in a most pressing time. And so in that context, this year, I want to name some budget cuts that were proposed by the mayor, by the city, and kind of the process that went on under a mayoral control system. So there was a proposed $197 million cut in childcare and 3K funding, $114 million cut funding for CUNY, which about 22% of all CUNY students identify as AA and HPI, and 14% of CUNY faculty also identifies as AA and HPI, which is Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander. There's also a proposed $10 million cut in teacher recruitment. This is significant because in addition to already seeing a shortage of educators and educators that are not being resourced or receiving the professional development that they need or deserve, we also within that see that there is a significant representation of AAPI educators in schools. So there needs to be an even more concentrated effort to recruit and retain students, but educators, but particularly also AAPI educators. But in the midst of that, there was a proposed $10 million cut in that recruitment process. An additional cut, we saw $5 million cut from the mental health continuum. This is significant because schools are places where a lot of students have the potential to access mental health resources. There are social workers that should be in schools. There are school nurses that should be in schools. There are mental health professionals that students should have access to. A lot of these things are influenced when there's not enough funding. The other thing that was cut, and I'm just naming a few examples, I'm not naming all of the things that were proposed to being cut, but just a few to kind of offer some context in the system that we're working in. Additionally, immigrant and family outreach communications was cut by $4 million. This is particularly impactful to the AAPI community because so many of our parents and community members and students identify as English language learners, are folks who are not particularly familiar with the New York City public school system and require a particular outreach mechanism so that they can actually understand what's happening in their school systems and make informed decisions on how they are going to approach their education. And so noting that threats to the school funding created an urgency that led to the formation of this Coalition for Equitable Education Funding about 2 years ago. And this coalition has been fighting tirelessly. And as a result of this advocacy, a lot of the funding cuts I just shared were restored. And so this includes a reversed, I should say, and this includes the funding I mentioned for childcare and 3K, for CUNY, for mental health continuum, for immigrant and family outreach communications, but also significant to note is that $2 million for teacher recruitment was not restored. And therefore, and to also note that there was no formal mechanism for students and parents to offer feedback through the formal school governance model. This is, of course, excluding the fact that there are budget hearings that happen through the city council that folks can testify at, but really in terms of a robust system being built out that is informed by parent, student, educator voices and advocate voices, the current mayoral control system does not build in a real opportunity for those voices to be received and have influence on these budget conversations in that way without extremely robust and extremely loud advocacy from a lot of the folks who are on this call. And I also want to note the nuance that despite the constant attacks on schools, on funding under a mayoral control system, schools have received a lot of funding under the system. So as Shino has mentioned, this is certainly not a black and white issue, and it's certainly not something that like, oh, we can just go back to the previous model and that was working seamlessly. That's certainly not the case. And it's certainly not the case that the system we're in right now is working seamlessly either. In addition to funding related challenges in the current system, there are policy related challenges, right? So the mayor, as mentioned, dictates the direction of various important policy matters. So this includes what is taught or not taught in this classroom. Perhaps you all have heard about NYC Reads or some other programs that are being implemented. And it also influences the ways that the school or the chancellor chooses to respond to bullying and harassment. When we've seen escalated school harassment or student harassment and bullying in the classroom in the past couple of years, the way that the administration responds to those things are also dependent and influenced by a mayoral control system. In addition to that, so are certain programs and policies, as Shino mentioned. 3K and pre-K is an example of perhaps a success story of sorts that comes from a mayor proposing and pushing for a policy that benefits many families in New York City. But it also shapes up in the way of perhaps proposing something like Project Pivot, which can lend itself to more policing in schools. So these are some different examples of policies that are significantly influenced at the very least by a mayoral control system. And it influences the way advocates, parents, and students and educators are able to be a part of the decision-making process. I know we've talked a lot about like what happened and what is happening, but perhaps it's a little bit hard to think about what is possible. And so to have that conversation or begin having that conversation, I want to briefly talk about some other cities that we can see to see what they're doing. Not to emulate, not to copy, but just to be informed of what's going on. There's really no other city like New York City, so I don't really feel like we're in a place to perhaps copy anyone, but to see what's going on, right? And so want to learn from Chicago, which is transitioning currently to an elected school board system and was previously a mayoral control system. Unfortunately, we won't have time too much to go into details of these examples, but I'm going to give a very high-level overview of briefly kind of what's going on. And of course, there's a lot of nuance here that we can definitely dive into in future sessions. Next example is the one of Los Angeles. So Los Angeles has a mayor influence, but with an elected school board. And so this is kind of more on the hybrid side, if you want to say that. So the mayor has limited control, but can push policies, and there's an elected board of education. Next is Boston. Boston has mayoral control or mayor appointed board, right? But is also considering a change here. Key thing to note here is there's no elected school board, but folks are advocating for that over there. Philadelphia, which is kind of a state and city hybrid model where the mayor and the governor influence the school board. The Philly Board of Education is appointed by the mayor, but they are also in a point of continued transition as it was previously until 2018 state controlled. where there was more oversight there. Washington, D.C., the mayor appoints the chancellor of D.C. public schools. This is more of a mayoral control system as well, but with an advisory board kind of model here. Houston, this is state takeover. Texas state influences a big portion of how Houston and other cities in Texas can move as it pertains to education. And so here we see kind of the loss of local control for a more state sanctioned approach. So I know that was really, really quick, but some key takeaways, right? That most large cities do have some form of elected school board. They have some form of advisory board. Mayoral control truly only exists in school districts where there's a majority of Black and people of color students. And New York City and DC are among the few major cities with full mayoral control. Other cities are moving towards a more public input approach, following criticisms of the ways that their mayoral control system was moving school policies. And so as Shino mentioned, we'll highlight here again, we're actually echoing this call for People's Commission to create a new system of school governance. Again, we don't necessarily have to replicate anything. We can envision what works best for New York City, but learn from what we've done in the past, what other cities are doing, what other communities are doing, and go from there in terms of seeing what's possible. So before, I'm going to stop sharing screen, and if I can. Amazing. Hopefully you all had great conversations in the breakout space. I know everyone is perhaps at different stages of processing information. For some, maybe a lot of new information, for some just like simmering in the existing information and thinking about how we can move ahead. Regardless, I think we had some great conversations. And I'll just ask each group, I'll bump it group by group. I'll just call, I don't think we had numbers or I didn't make notes, so I'll call on the team lead. And if either that team lead or the group representative from that team wants to share back, that's the way we can go about this. So we can start with Lloyd, if you or someone from your group wants to share.
Yeah, thanks, Kulsum. So first, I just wanted to give a shout out to the members of my breakout room. So I think there was Manal from Turning Point, Shirley from ALDEF, and Maria, who's at NYU Metro Center. And we had Serge from the DOE Policy and Advocacy. And so in terms of what we covered, things that surprised us about how New York City public schools are governed is that some things were surprising, some things were not so surprising, right? And then especially this idea of power being eliminated from parents from the ground level is particularly concerning. Leaders, you'd think, would be supporting public input and public priorities as much as possible. And then also at first glance, you'd think ed policy would be pretty straightforward, but there's actually a lot of stakeholders and parts of the process where things can also go south, right? And curriculum reform is one example of that, where there's constant challenges. There's also like the limits of local input, right? And not enough input and decision making from parents in the community, and what is lost, right, when that happens. Questions about what resources are available and what needs exist that parents actually know about that could ultimately guide policy to support their kids. Some of that just doesn't get surfaced, right, when they're left out of that process. Ideas of the takeover being actually less connected to the schools themselves, right? And so, we seen from Shino and Coulson's presentation, right, that there has been, less input in some ways, and that these have impacts on school districts with lots of Black and brown children and families and the resulting disenfranchisement from that entire process, right? And then, in terms of the second question, and we cover the third question too, local control of curriculum, hiring and firing types of schools. These are all important for communities and families to have. I think there's wide agreement about that. And then people are worried in particular about students not having a say in the decisions that will ultimately impact their school lives entirely. Things like metal detector policies and more need for student agency, right? And then finally, language access needs, especially for immigrant parents, being looped into how they can be part of the decision-making that impacts their kids. And then questions about, communication logistics, right? How can schools make sure that they're actually fostering a way to reach these families in a more robust way? So I'm going to pass it back to Kulsoom.
Thank you. Sounds like your group had a really robust conversation, which is great. I will pass it to Nikita and Nikita's group.
Hey folks. All right, I'm gonna shout out the folks in my group, which were Shino, Amy, Tiffany, and we also had, sorry, I'm looking through my screen, 𝙤𝙤𝙧𝙧𝙤𝙧 as well. We had a great conversation. I think the things that surprised us, the majority of us didn't really know too much about mayoral control or, public school governance. And so I think a lot of things just really surprised us, especially how much decision-making power the mayor has. You would think mayoral control would give it away in the title, but we were still surprised with how much power the mayor has. One thing that we talked about for much longer in terms of centering students and families in the governance process is three particular things. So more partnerships with community-based orgs in order to provide trainings for parent leaders to help them understand the system and advocate for themselves in the system. A lot of immigrant families don't understand the school system when they get here. And so these types of trainings would be really important, not just to build that education around it, but also to empower parents in that process as well. There actually used to be, Shino pointed out, there used to be a United Parents Association, which was a nonprofit volunteer group that was actually funded through like PTA annual dues. And they were a completely like independent entity that helped parents navigate the system and develop that parent leadership so they could move on to, serving on school boards, community education councils, etc. And so something like that would be really great to have, as well as just, general workshops for students as well on leadership development. And then similar to Lloyd's group, we also, one of the main barriers we talked about was the language barrier and making bilingual materials available and how we can train folks in that translation process to make things just way more available. But those are our main points. I'll pass it back to you, Kulsoom.
I will pass it to Felicia's group.
Thank you. We had Mohammed, Sarah, Caitlin, Helen, Rochelle, and Yuna in our group. And what was really interesting and important was that all of the advocates in the group had different levels of understanding of mayoral control. Some had heard of it before or learned about it in another space. Maybe this was a 101 for others, but overall, seeing mayoral control like a bargaining chip, and still trying to understand that its use as a power play in city and state government was one of the takeaways, as well as realizing that we know that mayoral control at its current state is not a perfect system, nor was the one previous. So realizing that each didn't work, but also had, in this case, mayoral control does have some positives to outcomes. We're realizing what is and what could the new system look like. And then in terms of bringing new students, centering students, families, and educators more effectively, we're thinking, maybe parent boards should have, instead of advisory, like CECs, it's more power in votes. Increasing student voice and inclusivity in the PEP is another aspect that seemed to be important in bringing more students into the governing process. And then lastly, we're thinking about barriers. And so language access was a big one. Thank you, Rochelle, for uplifting that. Huge barrier to parents and student families and students participating in the governance process. Thank you.
So, Jimin, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Kulsum. I actually have a volunteer from my group, and it's 𝙤𝙤𝙮𝙧𝙧𝙤𝙧, and I'm going to pass it to you.
Hi, everybody. 𝙤𝙤𝙮𝙧𝙧𝙧 former member of the panel for educational policy. So lots of things to say, but I think everybody has said a lot. I think the only thing, we did talk a lot about young people and how not just young people, but also families' experiences are really not brought into these structures or spaces, and how the engagement is not authentic. And so that not just includes the format of the meetings, the technical language that is in that space. It doesn't just include language justice, but also accessibility. So most of our public school buildings are not accessible. And in addition, capital improvements like not enough bandwidth, can't project in different ways. And then the fact that not just the local school boards, but also the panel for educational policy doesn't provide for hybrid meetings. So folks during the pandemic saw how much more engagement existed when there was a remote meeting for the panel, but unfortunately the iteration that we have right now doesn't allow for that. And I think most of everything else was expressed. So yes, feel free to yell out if I forgot something.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Okay, I will share on behalf of our group. We also had, just like it seems like everyone had a great conversation, some key points I'll highlight from our group. One, the kind of echoing this element of like surprising, but also not surprising given how we've seen the past few years and onward play out. It was interesting to kind of hear about like sometimes the pettiness that gets involved with like I think the example named of like pushing folks out if they disagree or are not with the majority opinion, and these sorts of things that are at play sometimes, but also naming that there was a collective understanding of that. It's surprising that there seems like very top down, that folks who should have more ability to inform decisions aren't necessarily having the space to do so. Also naming that our group talked about students needing to have voting power in a lot of these bodies where they are perhaps only serving as like an advisory or a non-voting member, or there's just not even enough student positions in those like CECs or things like that. And so that was also named as a point of improvement or something that can be done to increase student and parent educator involvement in school governance, but also increasing for the PEP, increasing the number of parents that parents can vote for, and reducing the number of mayoral appointees as an example, right? And then also naming some kind of admin but really impactful things that are in real time going on. The fact that there's a lot of unfilled seats, that there's a lot of bureaucratic like red tape that's hindering like the voting process, or there's like voting going on right now for CECs, and naming that real things like tech issues and other like the fact that there's not a lot of information out on how to engage and how to move through those systems is creating more gaps in ability or preventing folks from engaging. Language access was also mentioned in our group. So it's really great to hear that it's top of mind for so many folks, that to ensure that folks can be involved in school governance, we actually need to be able to actually communicate with the parents and students and educators that are engaging with the school system and are impacted by the school system. Some suggestions was just connecting folks who are interested together so we can move forward to discuss what comes next. Also putting together potentially a resource guide so that there is material available for parents who are interested in learning more on how they can get involved in their school governance model as it exists currently, or how they can understand it to advocate for perhaps a different model. So these are some things that came out of our group. I think someone put it in the chat, but really appreciate folks engaging. And if there's anything that any of the folks who shared back perhaps missed, or there's something that's coming to mind now, please put it in the chat. We're kind of keeping track of everything that's being said to help inform how we continue the conversation.